He was the people's Archduke, the brilliant reformer who held the power to stop the impending apocalypse of World War I. He lived a life of unimaginable imperial splendor, adored by the masses and surrounded by the greatest treasures of history. Yet he died, leaving behind a silent nursery, an extinguished bloodline, and a legacy that vanished into dust. His name, Archduke Rainer Ferdinand. How did the one man who could have saved the Austrian Empire end up defeated not by an enemy army, but by the deadly, invisible curse flowing through his own veins? That silence was inevitable. Rainer was crushed between two worlds that could never be reconciled. The suffocating world of imperial tradition he was born into, and the modern world he was desperate to join. To tell his story, we must peel back the layers of gold leaf and velvet that adorned the Habsburg court in the 19th century to reveal the rot underneath. He was born into a world that was a magnificent illusion, a gilded cage constructed of protocol, ceremony, and a desperate, terrified clinging to the past. When Rainer was born in Milan in 1827, the Austrian Empire was the dominant power of Central Europe, a sprawling multi-ethnic behemoth that included Germans, Hungarians, Czechs, Italians, Poles, and countless others. On the surface, it projected an image of eternal stability and imperial grandeur. The waltzes were playing in the ballrooms of Vienna, the coffee houses were full of intellectuals, and the army was a sea of pristine white uniforms. But this was a facade. Underneath, the empire was held together by a draconian police state, a censor's black ink, and a bureaucracy so complex it paralyzed progress. It was a world terrified of the future, ruled by men who believed that if they simply refused to acknowledge the changing world, the rise of democracy, the Industrial Revolution, the cry for national identity, those changes would simply cease to exist. Into this world of stifling tradition walked Rainer Ferdinand, a man who seemed by some genetic miracle to have escaped the dullness and lethargy that plagued so many of his kin. He was the son of Archduke Rainer Joseph, the viceroy of Lombardy Venetia, which meant that unlike his cousins growing up in the insular, gossip-filled echo chamber of Vienna, Rainer spent his formative years in the vibrant, sun-drenched, and politically volatile atmosphere of Italy. Milan in the 1830s and 40s was a hotbed of culture, art, and simmering revolution. It was a city that breathed a different air than the stuffy corridors of the Hofburg Palace. Here, the young Archduke was exposed to the friction between the imperial occupiers and a population that yearned for freedom. This upbringing instilled in him a pragmatism and a worldly perspective that was utterly alien to the senior branch of the family back in Austria. While his cousins were being drilled in the rigid Spanish court etiquette, a system of rules so strict it dictated how one could stand, sit, and even breathe in the presence of the emperor, Rainer was studying law, science, and the humanities. He was developing a mind that questioned, a mind that sought to understand the mechanics of governance rather than just assuming the divine right to rule. However, no amount of education or geographic distance could save him from the biological destiny of his house. We cannot tell the story of Rainer Ferdinand without confronting the open secret of the Habsburg dynasty, the devastating cost of their marital strategy. For centuries, the family had adhered to the motto, Belligerant Ali tu Felix Austria nub. Let others wage war, but you, happy Austria, marry. They had consolidated power not through conquest, but through strategic marriages, weaving a web of alliances across Europe. But as the centuries wore on, the pool of eligible royal partners shrank and the Habsburgs turned inward. They began to marry themselves. Uncle married niece, first cousin married first cousin over and over again in a desperate bid to keep their territories and their blue blood pure. By the time Rainer was a young man, the family tree was less of a branching canopy and more of a tangled, suffocating knot. Modern geneticists looking back at the Habsburg lineage have identified a coefficient of inbreeding that rivals, and in some cases exceeds that of siblings producing offspring. This genetic bottleneck did not just manifest in the famous Habsburg jaw, the protruding lower lip and misshapen mandible that made eating and speaking difficult for many emperors. It manifested in deeper, more invisible, and more tragic ways. It appeared as high rates of infant mortality, a prevalence of mental instability, and, most crucially for Rainer's story, a pervasive plague of infertility. The dynasty was literally breeding itself out of existence. The vitality was draining away generation by generation. Rainer, handsome, intelligent, and seemingly healthy, carried this invisible burden within his own DNA. He was a prince of the highest order, seemingly blessed by God, yet he was walking toward a biological cliff edge that had been centuries in the making. This is the central irony of his life. He possessed the mental capacity to reform the empire, but his body carried the legacy of the empire's oldest and most fatal mistake. As Rainer grew into adulthood, the cracks in the empire's facade began to widen into chasms. The year 1848, often called the Spring of Nations, swept across Europe like a wildfire. Revolutions erupted in Paris, Berlin, Budapest, and Vienna. The old order, which had seemed so permanent, suddenly looked fragile. In Vienna, the mob chased away the dreaded Prince Metternich, the architect of the police state, forcing the symbol of oppression to flee in a laundry cart. The Emperor Ferdinand I, a kindly but mentally incapacitated man who was himself a victim of severe inbreeding, was forced to abdicate. The empire was on the brink of disintegration. It was in this crucible of chaos that Rainer's character was forged. He saw firsthand that the old ways, the absolutism, the refusal to listen to the people, the reliance on brute military force, were unsustainable. He understood perhaps earlier than anyone else in his family that for the monarchy to survive, it had to evolve. It had to make a pact with modernity. While his cousin Franz Joseph, who ascended the throne at the tender age of 18 in the wake of the 1848 chaos, drew the lesson that he needed to be stronger, colder, and more autocratic to hold the empire together, Rainer drew the opposite conclusion. He saw the need for partnership. He saw the need for a constitution. This ideological divergence between the two cousins, Franz Joseph, the embodiment of the frozen past, and Rainer, the tentative hope for a liberal future, would define the political landscape of Austria for the next 2 decades. But before Rainer could ascend to the political stage, he would make a personal decision that would seal his fate as surely as any political decree. In 1852, he chose a wife. The woman he chose was Archduchess Maria Caroline. She was his cousin. In any other stratum of society, the closeness of their blood relation would have been cause for alarm or at least hesitation. But in the Habsburg world, it was celebrated as a perfect match. A dispensation was easily obtained from the Pope, a formality that the family treated as routine. By all accounts, this was not a cold, arranged marriage of state. Surviving letters and diaries suggest a genuine warmth, a deep and abiding affection between Rainer and Maria Caroline. They were intellectual equals, partners who shared a love for art and a distaste for the rigid frivolity of the Viennese court. They were a power couple before the term existed, glamorous, popular, and deeply in love. But as they stood at the altar, surrounded by the incense and the chanting of the choir, they were unknowingly stepping into a trap set by their ancestors. The very thing that made them a perfect Habsburg match, their shared lineage, was the very thing that would doom them to a silent, childless home. The early years of their marriage were marked by a hopeful expectation that slowly, agonizingly, curdled into despair. In the palaces of Vienna, a woman's worth, especially an archduchess's worth, was measured almost exclusively by her ability to produce an heir. A son was a dynastic necessity. A daughter was a diplomatic asset. To produce neither was a failure that was whispered about behind fans in the ballrooms and discussed with furrowed brows in the emperor's private chambers. Rainer and Maria Caroline found themselves isolated in their grief. Every month brought a new cycle of hope and disappointment. Every announcement of a pregnancy from a cousin or a sister-in-law was a fresh wound. The Habsburg curse was not a ghost story. It was a biological reality that sat at their dinner table every night. This private pain is crucial to understanding Rainer's public life. Perhaps it was the lack of a biological future, the knowledge that he would have no son to inherit his titles, that drove him to invest so heavily in the future of the state. If he could not leave a lineage of flesh and blood, he would leave a lineage of laws, of reforms, of a better, more just Austria. By the late 1850s, the Austrian Empire was once again in crisis. The young Emperor Franz Joseph had tried to rule as an absolute monarch, keeping all the reins of power in his own hands, but he was failing. The economy was stagnant, the bureaucracy was corrupt, and the Italian provinces, Rainer's childhood home, were in open revolt, backed by the French. The Austrian army, led by incompetent generals, appointed for their pedigree rather than their skill, suffered humiliating defeats at the battles of Magenta and Solferino in 1859. The loss of the rich province of Lombardy was a shock to the system. The empire was bankrupt, both financially and morally. The people were angry. The bankers refused to lend the state any more money unless there was oversight, unless there was a parliament. The emperor, backed into a corner, looked around for someone who could bridge the gap between the rigid monarchy and the angry liberals who demanded change. He needed a Habsburg who wasn't hated. He needed a Habsburg who understood the modern world. And so the spotlight turned to Archduke Rainer. He was known as the Liberal Archduke. He was the man who walked the streets without guards, the man who read progressive newspapers, the man who had kept his hands clean of the bloody repression of the post-1848 years. In 1861, in a move that shocked the conservative establishment, Emperor Franz Joseph appointed his cousin Rainer as the president of the Council of Ministers, effectively the Prime Minister of Austria. It was a moment of immense promise. For the first time, a member of the imperial family was leading the government not as a tyrant, but as a reformer. Rainer was not just a figurehead. He was a working politician, diving into the minutiae of tax codes, electoral laws, and infrastructure projects. He gathered around him a cabinet of liberals, men like Anton von Schmerling, who believed that Austria could be transformed into a constitutional state that respected the rule of law. This was the dawn of Rainer's golden era. For a brief shining moment, it seemed that the trajectory of history could be changed. He pushed through the February Patent, a constitution that created a bicameral parliament, the Imperial Council. He tried to modernize the judiciary, to loosen the grip of the Catholic Church on education, to stimulate industry. He envisioned an Austria that was centralized but fair, a German-led state that nevertheless protected the rights of its minorities. It was a noble vision, a rational vision. But Rainer was a rational man trying to govern an irrational empire. He was a man of logic in a world of passion. He did not fully grasp the depth of the ethnic hatreds that were simmering in Hungary, in Bohemia, in Galicia. He did not realize that offering a parliament in Vienna was not enough for people who wanted their own nations. And, perhaps most dangerously, he did not realize that his cousin, the emperor, was not a true convert to liberalism. Franz Joseph was merely biding his time, waiting for the storm to pass, so he could take back the power he believed was his by divine right. Rainer Ferdinand was stepping onto a political battlefield that was rigged against him from the start. He was fighting a war on two fronts, publicly against the rising tide of nationalism that threatened to tear the map of Europe apart, and privately against the silent genetic extinction of his own line. As he sat in his office in the Hofburg, surrounded by mountains of paperwork, trying to build a future for an empire that was already dying, the silence of his childless nursery at home must have echoed loudly in his heart. He was the architect of a new Austria, but he was building it on a foundation of sand. The tragedy was already in motion, a slow, grinding collision between the immovable object of Habsburg tradition and the irresistible force of the modern world. To step into the world of Archduke Rainer in 1861 is to step into a Vienna that was vibrating with a nervous electric energy. The neo-absolutism of the 1850s was dead, buried in the mud of the Italian battlefields. The censorship laws were relaxed, and for the first time in a decade, people were allowed to speak, to critique, and to dream. And at the center of this whirlwind stood Rainer Ferdinand. He was no longer just a charming prince with a taste for art. He was the president of the Council of Ministers, the public face of the new era. It is difficult for us today to grasp just how radical this was. For centuries, the Habsburgs had ruled from the shadows, their power mysterious and unapproachable. Now here was an archduke sitting in a cabinet meeting, debating budgets, infrastructure projects, and legal paragraphs with commoners and lawyers. He was attempting to perform a miracle, to transform a feudal autocracy into a modern constitutional state without a bloody revolution. The centerpiece of Rainer's political project was the February Patent of 1861. To the casual observer, it might sound like a dry legal document, but in reality it was a declaration of war against the past. It established a bicameral parliament, the Reichsrat, with a House of Lords and a House of Deputies. It promised that the emperor would no longer rule by decree alone. He would rule with the consent of the people, or at least the wealthy and educated segment of the people. Rainer, working closely with the brilliant but arrogant state minister Anton von Schmerling, envisioned a centralized Austria. They wanted to forge a single unified state identity where a citizen in Prague, a citizen in Trieste, and a citizen in Vienna all felt allegiance to the central parliament. They wanted to break the power of the old feudal nobility who still treated their provinces like private fiefdoms. It was a vision of German liberal efficiency. They believed that if they built good roads, sound schools, and a fair legal system, the diverse ethnic groups of the empire would happily trade their nationalist dreams for Austrian prosperity. For a brief honeymoon period, it seemed to work. The new parliament met in a temporary wooden building outside the Schottenor, nicknamed the Schmerling Theater. The atmosphere was raucous and hopeful. Rainer was the bridge between the crown and the parliament. He used his immense social grace to smooth over ruffled feathers. When the emperor, stiff and uncomfortable with these lawyer types, threatened to shut down the whole experiment, it was Rainer who talked him down, arguing that this was the only way to keep the banks lending money in the empire afloat. Rainer became the darling of the Viennese middle class. They saw him as their archduke. While Franz Joseph was seen as cold and distant, hiding behind the walls of the Hofburg, Rainer was seen everywhere. He was the people's Archduke, the proof that the dynasty could evolve. However, beneath the gleaming surface of this liberal experiment, a fatal flaw was festering. Rainer and Schmerling were centralists. They believed that power should flow from Vienna. But the empire was not a monolith. It was a patchwork. And the biggest, most powerful patch, the Kingdom of Hungary, was not interested in being just another province in a German-run empire. The Hungarians, led by the astute and immovable Ferenc Diak, viewed the February patent not as a gift of freedom, but as an illegal violation of their ancient rights. They argued that Franz Joseph was king of Hungary only because he had sworn to uphold the Hungarian constitution, not the Austrian one. They refused to recognize Rainer's parliament. They refused to send deputies to Vienna. This led to the phenomenon of the empty chairs. When the parliament met in Vienna, the seats reserved for the Hungarian representatives remained starkly, aggressively empty. It was a visual reminder of the empire's broken spine. Rainer found himself in an impossible position. He was trying to run a parliament that represented only half the empire. He and Schmerling tried to force the Hungarians to comply. They tried legal threats. They tried economic pressure. They tried propaganda. But the Hungarians simply engaged in passive resistance. They didn't rebel with guns. They rebelled with silence. They refused to pay taxes. They refused to serve in the administration. They simply waited. They knew that time was on their side and that eventually the Austrian state would run out of money. As the stalemate with Hungary dragged on from 1862 into 1863 and 1864, the relationship between Rainer and his cousin the Emperor began to disintegrate. We must remember the psychology of Franz Joseph. He was a man traumatized by the revolutions of 1848. He hated liberalism. He hated parliaments. He tolerated Rainer's experiment only because he was desperate for cash and military stability. But as the empty chair crisis deepened, Franz Joseph began to lose patience. He didn't care about constitutions or legal niceties. He cared about power. He saw that Rainer's centralist approach was driving the Hungarians away, perhaps towards total independence. And Franz Joseph would sooner burn the constitution to ash than lose his kingdom of Hungary. The tension in the family was palpable. Rainer was no longer the favorite cousin. He was the nagging conscience. He was the one constantly reminding the emperor of his legal obligations, of the promises made in the February patent. Franz Joseph, increasingly surrounded by conservative aristocrats, who whispered that Rainer was a dangerous radical, or worse, a Republican in a coronet, began to freeze him out. The shadow court that Rainer had built, the circle of intellectuals and scientists, became a place of suspicion. The secret police, always lurking in the background, began to file reports on the Archduke's associates. Was he too close to the press? Was he too friendly with the Jewish bankers? Was he plotting something? Rainer was not plotting. He was trying to save the emperor from himself, but he was fighting a losing battle against the changing tides of history. To the north, a new and terrifying threat was rising. Prussia, led by the iron-fisted Otto von Bismarck. Bismarck was everything Rainer was not: ruthless, militaristic, and unconcerned with liberal ideals. Bismarck wanted to unite Germany under Prussian rule, which meant kicking Austria out of German affairs. Rainer and his government saw the threat. They knew the Austrian army was still weak, still recovering from the defeats of 1859. They argued for diplomacy, for caution, but the conservative generals in the emperor's ear were itching for a fight, convinced they could crush the upstart Prussians. The final unraveling of Rainer's political career began in 1865. The economy was once again tanking. The passive resistance of the Hungarians was bleeding the treasury dry. The investors were panicking. Emperor Franz Joseph, a man who viewed politics purely as a series of tactical maneuvers, decided it was time to change course. He needed a deal with Hungary, and he realized he could never get one as long as Rainer and Schmerling were in power. The Hungarians hated Schmerling. He was the symbol of Viennese arrogance. To make peace with Budapest, Franz Joseph had to sacrifice Vienna. The betrayal, for that is how Rainer must have felt it, was swift and brutal. In the summer of 1865, Franz Joseph made a surprise visit to Budapest. He was greeted not with silence, but with cautious optimism by the Hungarian nobility. They signaled that they were ready to talk, but only if the German centralists were removed. Franz Joseph returned to Vienna with his mind made up. On June 27, 1865, the blow fell. The emperor did not even have the courtesy to debate the issue in the council. He simply issued a decree. The February patent, Rainer's constitution, his life's work, was suspended. The liberal cabinet was dismissed. Schmerling was out. And Rainer, the president of the council, was stripped of his executive power. It was a soft coup executed by the monarch against his own government. The scene of Rainer's departure is one of quiet, devastating dignity. There were no public tantrums. He did not rally the mob, though he likely could have. He simply packed his papers. He resigned his position, adhering to the protocol that had governed his entire life. But the emotional wound was deep. He had been used. He had been brought in to clean up the emperor's mess, to use his popularity to stabilize the throne. And the moment he became inconvenient, he was discarded. The liberal era was over. The windows of the Habsburg that had been briefly thrown open to the fresh air of reform were slammed shut again. The tragedy of Rainer's fall is compounded by what happened next. Less than a year after he was fired, the catastrophe he had tried to prevent arrived. In 1866, Austria went to war with Prussia. The result was the Battle of Königgrätz, the greatest military disaster in Austrian history. The Austrian army, still led by the incompetent aristocratic clique that Rainer had tried to sideline, was annihilated by the modern, efficient Prussian war machine. Austria was kicked out of Germany forever. In the panic that followed, Franz Joseph had no choice. He was on his knees. He had to make a deal with the Hungarians at any price to save his throne. The result was the Ausgleich of 1867. This created the dual monarchy of Austria-Hungary. It was not the unified constitutional state Rainer had dreamed of. It was a bizarre two-headed monster. Hungary became virtually an independent state with its own parliament and army, united with Austria only by the person of the emperor and a few common ministries. For Rainer, the Ausgleich was the death knell of his vision. He believed it was a fatal mistake. He believed that by giving the Hungarians special status, the emperor had alienated the Slavs, the Czechs, the Croats, the Poles, who now felt like second-class citizens. Rainer predicted that this ethnic resentment would eventually tear the empire apart, and he was right. The structure created in 1867, built on the ruins of Rainer's 1861 constitution, set the clock ticking toward 1914. Rainer Ferdinand was now 40 years old. He was a man in the prime of his life with immense experience and talent, yet he was now politically dead. He retreated from the public stage. He watched from the sidelines as the Liberal Party he had nurtured eventually returned to power in the Austrian half of the empire, but without him at the helm. He became a grand old man before his time, a relic of a lost opportunity. This political sterility mirrored his personal sterility. Just as his constitution had failed to produce a unified nation, his marriage continued to fail to produce an heir. The years of his premiership, 1861 to 1865, had been the years of peak fertility for his wife, Maria Caroline. The stress of those years, the late nights, the constant crises, surely took their toll on their private life. Now, as the political pressure lifted, the silence of the nursery became even more deafening. There were no distractions left. There was only the vast empty palace, the collection of medals and honors that meant nothing to a man with no son to wear them, and the realization that his branch of the Habsburg family tree was withering on the vine. But Rainer did not succumb to bitterness. He did not become a dissolute wastrel like his cousin Archduke Otto, nor did he retreat into madness like Ludwig of Bavaria. Instead, he channeled his grief and his formidable intellect into a new passion, one that would preserve the voices of the past even as his own voice was being silenced in the present. He turned his eyes from the chaotic map of Europe to the sands of Egypt. If he could not build the future, he would save the history of the world. When a man of action is denied the battlefield, and a man of state is denied the parliament, he must either wither away or build a new kingdom in the only territory left to him, the realm of the intellect. For Archduke Rainer Ferdinand, the year 1867 marked the death of his political life, but it was the birth of his legacy as one of the greatest cultural guardians in European history. He was now a prince in exile within his own capital, stripping away the trappings of power to reveal the scholar underneath. If he could not secure the biological future of his dynasty through a son, and if he could not secure the political future of his empire through a constitution, he would dedicate the remainder of his life to preserving the memory of humanity itself. It is in this phase of his life that Rainer began to amass what is arguably his most enduring contribution to civilization, the papyrus Erzherzog Rainer. It was not merely a hobby for a bored aristocrat. It was an obsession. In the late 19th century, Egypt was yielding up its secrets. Excavations in the Fayum oasis were uncovering mounds of ancient trash, rubbish heaps from the Roman and Byzantine eras that contained thousands of discarded documents. While other royals were collecting trophies, hunting exotic animals, or buying flashy jewelry, Rainer was buying history. He funded excavations and purchased massive lots of these fragile papyri. He didn't just want the important texts, the literature, or the royal decrees. He wanted the receipts, the tax returns, the personal letters between husbands and wives, the shopping lists of people who had been dead for 2,000 years. There is a profound psychological resonance here. Rainer, a man whose own lineage was ending in silence, became the savior of the voices of common forgotten people. By the time he donated his collection to the Imperial Library in 1899, it numbered over 100,000 items. It was and remains one of the most significant collections in the world. It contains the oldest known fragment of a musical score from Euripides and some of the earliest witnesses to the text of the New Testament. While Rainer was preserving the past, the present was crumbling around him. The later years of the Habsburg monarchy are often romanticized as a golden age of waltzes and operettas. But for the family itself, it was a horror story of mental instability, suicide, and violence. The inevitable harvest of the genetic seed sown centuries before. Rainer, the stable, sane, and happily married grand old man, became a silent witness to the destruction of his kin. He watched as his cousin, Emperor Franz Joseph, became a figure of almost biblical suffering. The curse of the Habsburgs seemed to hunt the emperor down. First, the execution of his brother Maximilian in Mexico, then the tragedy that shook the world, Mayerling. In 1889, Crown Prince Rudolf, Franz Joseph's only son and heir, was found dead in a hunting lodge, having shot his mistress and then himself. This event shattered the soul of the dynasty. Rainer must have felt this loss with a unique and terrible acuity. Rudolf was, in many ways, the spiritual son Rainer never had. Like Rainer, Rudolf was a liberal. Like Rainer, Rudolf hated the rigid clericalism and conservatism of the court. Like Rainer, Rudolf had yearned for a modern constitutional Austria. When Rudolf put a bullet in his brain, he wasn't just killing himself. He was killing the very political vision that Rainer had fought for in the 1860s. The liberal dream died in that hunting lodge, leaving the future of the throne to the arch-conservative Archduke Franz Ferdinand. Rainer, now in his 60s and 70s, became a pillar of stability in a family going mad. He was the good Habsburg. He didn't have scandals. He didn't have mistresses. He was the president of the Academy of Sciences, the curator of museums, the man who represented the dignity of the old world without its madness. But this dignity came at a price: invisibility. Because he wasn't tragic and because he wasn't scandalous, he began to fade into the background. He was a piece of living furniture in the Hofburg, respected but increasingly irrelevant to the high-stakes power games being played by the younger generation. There is perhaps no image more poignant in Rainer's life than his diamond wedding anniversary in February 1912. 60 years of marriage. It was a milestone almost unheard of in royal circles. The entire empire celebrated. There were processions, commemorative coins, and masses of thanksgiving. The newspapers hailed them as the ideal couple, the grandmother and grandfather of the nation. But look closer at the photographs from that day. You see two people who are deeply, profoundly alone together. They are surrounded by nephews and grandnephews, by the teeming generations of other Habsburg branches, but they stand on an island of their own childlessness. The cheering crowds could not fill the silence of their home. This celebration was a victory of longevity, yes, but it was also a farewell. They were the last survivors of a bygone era. They were the last ones who remembered the world before 1848, before the railways, before the telephone. They were relics, and they were dying. The biological clock that had denied them children was now ticking down the final seconds of their own lives. The atmosphere in Vienna in 1912 and 1913 was suffocating. We know now what they could only sense. The end of the world was coming. The Balkans were on fire. The arms race between Britain and Germany was escalating. The spies were everywhere. The Austrian general staff, led by the hawk Konrad von Hötzendorf, was openly calling for a preventive war against Serbia. The empire was like a sleepwalker stumbling toward a cliff. Rainer Ferdinand, with his encyclopedic knowledge of history, surely sensed the danger. He had seen the defeats of 1859 and 1866. He knew that the Austrian army was a paper tiger, held together by pomp and circumstance. He knew that a war would not be the cleansing thunderstorm the generals promised, but a funeral pyre. But by 1913, no one was listening to the 86-year-old man in the museum. He was a ghost from the Biedermeier era, a man who spoke of constitutions and compromises in an age of machine guns and ultimatums. Archduke Rainer Ferdinand of Austria died on a Monday afternoon, January 27, 1913. He was 86 years old. His death was not dramatic. There was no assassination, no poison, no scandal. His heart simply stopped beating. It was the quiet end of a quiet tragedy. His beloved wife, Maria Caroline, was devastated. They had been the two halves of a whole for 6 decades. She would survive him by only a few months, dying in July of the same year. It was as if she could not bear to exist in a world where he was not. The funeral was grand, of course. The plumed horses, the black carriages, the slow march of the regiments. Emperor Franz Joseph, now a frail old man himself, walked behind the coffin of the cousin he had betrayed, the cousin he had outmaneuvered, the cousin who had in the end been the better man. One has to wonder what the emperor was thinking as he watched Rainer's coffin descend into the crypt. Did he regret the dismissal of 1865? Did he wonder if Rainer's liberal path might have saved them from the nightmare that was looming on the horizon? The timing of Rainer's death is the final, brutal irony of his story. He died in January 1913. 17 months later, in June 1914, the Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the man who displaced Rainer's liberal vision with his own aggressive conservatism, traveled to Sarajevo. Rainer escaped. He was granted the mercy of dying before he could see the destruction of everything he loved. He did not have to see the declaration of war. He did not have to see the Russian steamroller crush the Austrian armies in Galicia. He did not have to see the starvation in Vienna, the dissolution of the empire in 1918, or the exile of his family. He died with the illusion of the empire still intact, however fragile. But his death meant something else. It meant the instant, total extinction of his line. When the stone lid was slid over his sarcophagus in the Imperial crypt, a branch of the House of Habsburg that had existed for centuries was simply gone. The titles reverted to the crown. The palaces were emptied. The collections were transferred to the state. It was a total erasure of a biological legacy. Today, if you visit the Austrian National Library, you can see the papyrus Erzherzog Rainer. You can look at the Fayum portraits, those haunting, realistic faces of ancient Egyptians that stare back at you across the millennia. Rainer loved these faces. He saved them from the dust. There is a profound symmetry here. Rainer Ferdinand was a victim of his family's obsession with blood. The inbreeding that was meant to preserve their power instead rendered him sterile. But in his sterility, he found a way to defeat time. He couldn't leave behind a son to rule a crumbling empire, so he left behind a library that contains the memory of the world. The empire is gone. The titles are meaningless. The borders have been redrawn a dozen times, but the texts he saved, the letters of forgotten lovers, the prayers of ancient priests, they are still here. He was the Archduke of what might have been, yes, but he was also the Archduke of what endures. In the end, perhaps he won. The Emperor Franz Joseph tried to hold on to power and lost everything. Rainer Ferdinand let go of power and saved the truth. But the story of the Habsburgs didn't end with the fall of the empire. The consequences of that biological and political collapse are still with us today. The vacuum left by the Habsburgs in Central Europe was filled by chaos, by fascism, and by the Cold War. Rainer's failure, or rather the failure of the system to use him, was the first domino in a chain reaction that shaped the 20th century. So as we leave Rainer in the cool silence of the crypt, we are left with the haunting question, what is the true cost of a legacy? Is it the blood we leave behind, or is it the beauty we preserve in the face of our own extinction? When Archduke Rainer Ferdinand breathed his last in January 1913, the Austrian newspapers wrote polite obituaries about a grand seigneur and a patron of the arts. They treated his death as the passing of a harmless relic. But historians looking back through the lens of the catastrophe that followed can see something the contemporaries missed. Rainer was one of the last anchors holding the ship of state to sanity. His death created a specific dangerous void in the Hofburg Palace. For decades, Rainer had been the senior archduke, the eldest and most respected member of the family after the emperor himself. Even if he had been politically sidelined, His mere presence served as a check on the wilder impulses of the younger generation. He was the living memory of the consequences of war. He remembered 1859. He remembered 1866. He knew that the Austrian army was a brittle instrument that would shatter if struck too hard. With Rainer gone, Emperor Franz Joseph was increasingly isolated. He was an 82-year-old man surrounded by ghosts. The only strong voice left in his ear was that of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the heir presumptive. But unlike Rainer, who was a man of compromise and culture, Franz Ferdinand was a man of explosive temper and rigid ideas. And opposing him were the war hawks led by General Conrad von Hötzendorf, who viewed peace as a sign of weakness. Rainer had been a safety valve, a bridge to the liberal middle class and the scientific community. When he died, that bridge collapsed. The court turned inward, becoming an echo chamber of paranoia. There's a terrible irony in the fate of the soldiers who wore Rainer's name. In the Austrian tradition, regiments were owned by members of the Imperial family. Rainer was the colonel proprietor of the Infantry Regiment No. 59, based in Salzburg. These were Rainer's boys. He had inspected them, funded them, and taken pride in their discipline. In 1914, just a year after his death, these young men, peacetime soldiers who had marched in parades for Rainer's Diamond Jubilee, were thrown into the meat grinder of the Eastern Front. They were sent to Galicia to fight the Russian Empire. The reports from the front lines in late 1914 describe a slaughter. The Austrian army, led by the incompetent aristocratic officers that Rainer had spent his life distrusting, was decimated. Rainer's regiment suffered horrific casualties. The liberal army he had envisioned, a professional, well-equipped force protecting a constitutional state, died in the mud of Ukraine. Instead of protecting civilization, they were sacrificed on the altar of a dying dynasty's vanity. If Rainer had lived to see the telegrams reporting the annihilation of his regiment, it would likely have killed him. While the world was tearing itself apart in the trenches, a quieter dismantling was happening in the homes Rainer had left behind. Because Rainer and Maria Caroline had no children, their death sparked a complex legal and logistical question. What happens to the accumulated wealth of a childless prince? Rainer was incredibly wealthy. He owned palaces in Vienna, the magnificent villa in Gmunden, and vast tracts of land. In a normal lineage, this wealth would pass to a son, keeping the power concentrated. But in Rainer's case, the Habsburg curse of infertility meant that his estate was fragmented. His last will and testament is a fascinating document of a man trying to curate his own memory. He left generous bequests to his staff, valets, secretaries, and servants who had become his surrogate family. He left money to the Academy of Sciences. But the bulk of his property reverted to the main line of the family, or was distributed among nieces and nephews who had little emotional connection to him. Then came 1918. The war ended. The empire collapsed. Emperor Karl, the young and hapless successor to Franz Joseph, was forced to renounce power. The Habsburg Law of 1919 was passed by the new Republican government. This was a revolutionary act. It stripped the Habsburgs of their sovereign rights and banished any family member who refused to renounce their royal pretensions. Rainer's legacy was caught in this revolutionary wave. His palaces were no longer the homes of a revered elder statesman. They were now state property or assets to be liquidated to pay off the crushing war debts. The Villa Rainer in Gmunden, where he had spent his happiest summers arranging his papyri and hosting scientists, was eventually sold off. The personal touches, the specific arrangement of the furniture, the private letters in the desk drawers were scattered. This is the second death of Archduke Rainer. The first was the stopping of his heart. The second was the dismantling of his home. When a man leaves no heirs, there is no one to guard the sanctuary of his private life. His possessions appear in auction catalogs. His intimate gifts to his wife end up in antique shops. The physical evidence of his existence was atomized, blown away by the winds of the new Republican era. However, amidst this liquidation, one part of Rainer's soul survived, the papyrus Erzherzog Rainer, and its survival is a story worthy of a spy thriller. Rainer had donated the collection to the emperor in 1899, a decade before his death. This act of generosity saved it. Because it was already state property, it wasn't auctioned off like his furniture. It remained in the Imperial Library. But the 20th century was not kind to libraries in Vienna. First came the collapse of 1918. The new Austrian Republic was starving. There were serious discussions about selling off national art treasures to buy food and coal. American millionaires circled Vienna like vultures, hoping to buy up the Habsburg collections. But the curators, men whom Rainer had appointed or mentored, stood firm. They argued that the collection was the cultural heritage of humanity and could not be sold. The papyri stayed. Then came a darker threat. In 1938, Adolf Hitler stood on the balcony of the Hofburg, the very palace where Rainer had lived, and announced the Anschluss, the annexation of Austria, by Nazi Germany. The Nazis were obsessed with history, but only history that served their twisted racial narrative. They looked at the papyrus Erzherzog Rainer with suspicion. Here was a collection full of Semitic languages, Arabic, Hebrew, Aramaic. It was a testament to the multicultural, multi-ethnic history of the Middle East and Mediterranean. It was everything the Nazis hated. During the World War II, as Allied bombers began to target Vienna, the curators faced a nightmare scenario. If a bomb hit the library, 100,000 documents, 3,000 years of history, would vanish in a puff of smoke. In a desperate operation, the most valuable parts of the collection were packed into crates and moved to safety. They were hidden in salt mines, in the Austrian countryside, and in reinforced bank vaults. Rainer, dead for 30 years, was still influencing events. The prestige of his name, attached to the collection, helped the curators argue for the resources to protect it. Even the Nazis hesitated to destroy a collection that bore the name of a German Archduke. When the war ended in 1945 and the smoke cleared over a ruined Vienna, the crates were opened. They were intact. The words of Egyptian farmers, Coptic monks, and Arab merchants had survived the madness of the 20th century. Rainer's paper children had outlived the stone palaces of his ancestors. Now that we have traced the fate of his empire and his possessions, we must return to the man himself and the biological mystery that defined him. Why did this healthy, intelligent man leave no children? In recent years, scientists from the University of Santiago de Compostela and other institutions have conducted comprehensive genetic studies on the Habsburg dynasty. They used historical records to calculate the inbreeding coefficient for each member of the family. To give you a frame of reference, if you marry a random person, the coefficient is near zero, and for first cousins it is 0.0625. However, if a brother and sister were to have a child, that figure rises to 0.25. The last Habsburg king of Spain, Charles II, had a coefficient of 0.254. He was physically disabled, mentally challenged, and impotent. Archduke Rainer Ferdinand was not disabled. He was highly intelligent. But the genetics of his marriage were a ticking time bomb. Both he and his wife, Maria Caroline, were descendants of the same tight web of ancestors. Their cumulative genetic load was immense. The scientific consensus today is that the Habsburgs suffered from a cumulative accumulation of recessive deleterious alleles. In plain English, everyone carries a few bad genes that are usually silenced by a good gene from their partner. But when you marry your cousin and your parents married their cousins, you lose those good genes. The bad genes take over. In Rainer's case, this likely manifested as male factor infertility or early-stage embryonic lethality. It is very possible that Maria Carolina did conceive, perhaps multiple times, but the genetic errors were so severe that the pregnancies ended before they were even recognized, or resulted in stillbirths that were kept out of the official records. This adds a layer of profound tragedy to their story. It wasn't just bad luck, it was biology. Rainer was a victim of his ancestors' hubris. They believed their blood was so special it shouldn't be mixed with others. In reality, that blood was becoming toxic. Rainer Ferdinand serves as the perfect control group for this study. He shows us that the Habsburg curse wasn't always about visible deformity like the jaw. Sometimes it was a silent killer. It killed the future. It stopped the line dead in its tracks. His infertility is not just a personal detail. It is a historical turning point. If Rainer had had a son, a liberal, educated, constitutionalist heir, that son would have been in his prime in 1914. He would have been a cousin to Archduke Franz Ferdinand. He would have been a voice of reason in the Council of War, but that son did not exist. The biology of the dynasty ensured that the only voices left in 1914 were the madmen and the reactionaries. Rainer's life teaches us that history is not just made by treaties and battles. It is made by chromosomes. It is made by the microscopic accidents of birth and death. The fall of the Austrian Empire didn't begin with a gunshot in Sarajevo. It began in the marriage beds of the 18th and 19th centuries, where the desire for purity sowed the seeds of extinction. But Rainer's biological line had ended. His true legacy was just being born. In the biology of kings, a legacy is defined by blood. It is a son who looks like you, who wears your crown, and who passes your name to the next generation. By this standard, Rainer Ferdinand was a failure, a dead branch on a withering tree. But there is another kind of legacy. In the climate-controlled vaults of the Austrian National Library, the papyrus Erzherzog Rainer collection rests. It is not just a pile of old paper, it is a portal. Among the 180,000 objects are documents that have fundamentally changed our understanding of human history. Consider this irony. Rainer spent his political life trying to create a constitution that would grant rights to the diverse citizens of the Austrian Empire. He failed. The constitution was suspended. The empire collapsed. Yet within his collection lies one of the oldest surviving fragments of a musical score from Greek antiquity, a chorus from Euripides' Orestes. He preserved the very melody of the ancient world. Do you see the poetry in that? The Archduke, who could not legally unite his own people, ended up preserving the document that united the ancient world. He couldn't give the gift of citizenship to the Czechs and Hungarians of the 19th century, but he saved the proof of it for the citizens of Rome. His paper children are more numerous and more honest than any biological heir could have been. A biological son might have been a disappointment. He might have been a warmonger, a fool, or a tyrant. But the papyri do not lie. They tell us about the price of wheat in 400 AD, the prayer of a mother for her sick child in 700 AD, the receipt for a donkey sold in 1000 AD. Rainer, the man who lived in a palace disconnected from the common people, spent his fortune saving the voices of the commonest people of all. In his sterility, he became the father of social history. He bypassed the kings and generals to listen to the whispers of the forgotten. In a way, this was the ultimate expression of his liberal soul.